Exactly 400 years ago, England was waiting for invaders to attack the south coast. The Armada was in the Channel, planning to escort the army of Flanders to England. Their orders were to anchor just offshore in the Downs and set ashore 30,000 men. The small towns along the coast, towns like Deal and Sandwich, would have borne the brunt of the first attack. The coast was too long to defend. England did not have an army large enough. The first line of defense would be left to the local militia in each little town. The churches were used to store their arms. This church at Mendlesham in Surrey still contains armor to be worn by the townspeople in the defense of the south coast of England. And in Europe, the Habsburg armories still store equipment too. The equipment of a highly efficient, battle-hardened force still ready after 400 years. The ghostly army of the Catholic Empire still waits its hour. The invasion force was waiting in Flanders. The Armada was not to attack England alone. Its task was to escort the army and make the crossing safe. For a week, while the Catholic army waited, the Armada sailed along the English coast slowly and in fixed formation. The English skirmished at the edges. Little by little we plucked their feathers, but had not found any way to disturb it. Until the Armada anchored off Calais to make contact with the army. That night, the English floated blazing hulks into their crowded anchorage. In their hurried escape from the fireships, the Spanish broke formation. They were expecting hellburners, the deadly floating bombs which the engineer Jambelli had constructed to defend Antwerp. They knew he was in England. In fact, these ships were just blazing hulks with their guns primed, but the trick had worked. The Spanish cut their anchor cables and struggled out to sea. They had not collected the invasion army. By dawn, the Armada was scattered along the coast between Calais and Dunkirk. Its impregnable formation was broken. Now the English would have to battle it out ship to ship along the sandbanks off Gravelines. If they failed now, the next line of defense was in England. At the crucial moment of the battle, the Lord High Admiral of England went away. A galleass had drifted aground trying to leave Calais, and Lord Howard decided to loot it. There was a bitter struggle which only ended when the captain of the galleass was shot through the head. Howard's men were then driven off by the guns of Calais. The ship was a French prize, not an English one. All this gave the Armada time to regroup. Meanwhile, the invasion army was preparing to come out from the beaches of Flanders. While they boarded their barges, the soldiers could actually hear the gunfire close offshore. All they needed was a little time. They were boarding faster than they had done in any practice session. Little enough now stood between them and London. Jambeli was working feverishly to build a blockade, a bridge of boats across the Thames at Tilbury, a flimsy barrier against an overwhelming force. Once the Armada had brought the army across to Kent, it was likely to sail into the Thames and then directly to London. The army would shadow it, marching across country. The two forces would meet at the capital. The simple defences of southeast England were unlikely to withstand its weapons. We know just what was to be used in the attack because the Spanish artillery has been brought up from the wrecks on the Irish coast. This is one of the guns which was to be used to batter down the gates of London and bring England back under the control of its former king.
This is one of the most powerful weapons in Philip II's armory. It's a great siege cannon, part of the train of such guns set up by Philip in the Low Countries in the early years of his reign. It carries not only his own arms, but those of England, because in 1556, when this gun was cast, Philip was married to Mary Tudor.
By an extraordinary chance, we know all about this gun. Its weight mark acts as a fingerprint to trace its history through the Spanish archives. This is one of the drawings prepared for the Spanish Armada. It shows that this gun was part of the most powerful artillery train in Europe. There was hardly a wall in England that could withstand it.
Here in the National Maritime Museum's Armada exhibition, where I'm surrounded by the bric-a-brac of an English parish armory, you can see just what sort of army the English wanted. They wanted a free citizen force, rooted in its parishes, animated by the desire to defend its own homes. And what they got in consequence, as you might imagine, was a shambles.
The English had 40,000 men under arms, but hardly any of them had any training. Their equipment varied wildly, and there was a great reluctance on everyone's part to pay them.
The English didn't know what they were doing anyway. They were in ignorance about Spanish plans. On the whole, the consensus in the English High Command, if one can call it that, was that the Spaniards would attempt to land in Essex. The second most widely canvassed possibility was that they would attempt to seize the Isle of Wight. In fact, they intended to do neither, and as a result, 26,000 English militia were spread along the south coast where they were useless, and most of the professional army was concentrated in Essex, where it would have been unable to confront the Spanish invasion had one taken place.
Their only chance of getting from Tilbury to the invasion beaches was over that famous bridge of boats. Unfortunately, Jambeli was still building it when the Armada arrived, and then it collapsed under its own weight. There was no place for Elizabeth in Philip's plans for the future of England. And with her land forces apparently so weak, her survival depended on the fleet driving the Armada away. Having abandoned his galleass, Howard returned to Gravelines to continue the attack. Now the English ships were fighting much closer to the Spanish than they ever had before. Firing 3 times as quickly, tacking rapidly to avoid being grappled, they seemed to have lost any fear of the Spanish force. The Armada ships began to take a real hammering.
English gunnery and the wind were pressing the Armada towards the treacherous shoals of the Flemish banks. The hulls of the Spanish ships, laden as they were with men and munitions, drew as much as 25 feet. And this was the lowest tide of the year, as it is now.
The English broke off battle in the afternoon. They were running out of shot, and the Armada was being driven northeast by the wind. That night, the Spanish pressed closer and closer to the sandbanks. Everyone on board understood what it would mean to strike the sand. The Armada's routine of prayers took on a special urgency. Many believed that this was their last hour. And then, suddenly, the wind veered. They were saved. They were blown into the North Sea, away from the sand, the English, and the waiting Spanish army.
This was the first time in history that a really large-scale naval action had taken place using gunfire alone. And at Gravelines, that gunfire was at extremely close range. So what damage did each side mete out on the other? Only one ship, a Spaniard, was actually sunk, but many others were badly damaged, and casualties on all of them were high. Some Spanish ships, indeed, damaged themselves with the recoil of their own artillery because their hulls were simply not designed for this kind of thing. From the English side, the story is very different. We have here the carpenter's accounts of the Queen's galleons which were brought in for repair after the fighting. And they tell us a spar cracked here, a plank to be replaced there, nothing really beyond that we'd expect from normal routine maintenance.
This is just one of the volumes of accounts compiled about the ships that sailed with the Spanish Armada. All the papers in here concern one ship. They took something like 70 years to close, to finish the audit. Within them, you find details on what was aboard, who was aboard, what they ate, what they did. The findings in this and the other legajos of documents revolutionize our understanding of the Armada and its problems. These documents show, for example, that the Spanish ships were not larger than the English ships. On the contrary, the largest of the English ships was bigger by far than the largest of the Spaniards. They show that the guns on the Spanish ships were less numerous than we had thought. And above all, and this perhaps is the most interesting detail right down at the bottom, they show that those guns did not fire as often as we had thought. It's all itemized. The days on which the guns fire, the number of times they're fired, the size of the shot, the amount of the powder. Everything is detailed here. And what it shows is that the guns hardly fire at all.
It used to be thought that the Armada had run out of shot. But 5 of the wrecks have now been discovered. I've worked on 3 of them. And although they're all of very different types of ships, all of the wrecks were involved very heavily in the fighting. And each one of them has produced large quantities of shot of all calibers, but particularly of the larger calibers. So why wasn't this shot fired off at the English?
The answer may lie on the wrecks, along with those unused cannonballs. And while we were shooting this film, one possible clue turned up on the seabed in the scattered remains of the Trinidad Valancero.
What we've got here looks like a gun carriage. It's the first gun carriage I've ever seen on an Armada wreck. 2 big cheek pieces joined together with transoms, and one of the axle stubs, very wide, far too wide for a small, solid truck carriage. This looks much more like a stump for a land carriage, a big spoked wheel. But I don't think this is wide enough, certainly isn't, to hold one of the big siege guns. And as far as we know, they're the only carriages on board the ship that were designed specially for land use. But this one looks very like a land carriage. It's immensely long. Here's another transom coming down. The ends are splaying apart towards the trail. We're coming, oh yes, we're coming up to the trail now. What a length. Good 4 meters. Coming up to the trail transom. This is the key bit, because if it's a land carriage, it ought to have a hole. But there isn't a hole. This is a sea carriage, beyond any doubt, a Venetian sea carriage on board the Trinidad Valenciera. It's about 14 feet long. With its gun mounted, it must have been extended at least halfway across the deck. Terribly, terribly inefficient for working the guns in a sea battle continuously.
The documents in Simancas show that on average Spanish guns were only fired 2 or 3 times a day. Was this the problem? Were the Spanish guns so inefficiently mounted that they could not be worked continuously? We did not lift the carriage. It's safer where it is. But Colin Martin carefully measured it and drew it out so that we could build a replica and see if his theory is right.
The evidence from the wreck of La Trinidad Valenciera has allowed us to reconstruct at full size a gun carriage as actually used on the decks of a Spanish Armada vessel during the Armada fighting. And it's truly massive. It weighs itself about 1.75 tons, and with the 2 tons or so of gun on top of it, the inertia would have helped to absorb a lot of the recoil during firing. But at the same time, it would have made it immensely difficult to bring it inboard for rapid reloading during a continuous artillery action such as occurred at Gravelines.
To find out whether this gun carriage really did create problems, the Royal Naval Field Gun Team from Portsmouth experimented with it. Because it is so large, it can only be moved back a short distance before it must be turned. We know from documentary sources that it was normal to reload these guns after turning them. That was the only way the long rammer could be kept inboard. The barrel has to be swabbed out, a new powder cartridge inserted, and then in goes the shot, packed in hemp wadding. Reloading this gun is a major task. And this ship is not being thrown around in a rising sea or being fired at. Just for comparison, we tried the same exercise with an English sea carriage. In fact, this one dates from about 50 years before the Armada. It was found on the wreck of the Mary Rose. Being shorter, it can come back much further, and it doesn't have to turn so far. And it is much lighter to turn. The point is, this system is designed for repeated use during a battle. The difference may not be crucial, though. In this exercise, it took 2.5 minutes to reload the English gun and 5 minutes to reload the Spanish one. By itself, this does not really explain why the Spanish only fired a big gun a couple of times a day. Perhaps the explanation lies more in the fact that the Spanish ships moved and turned so awkwardly and had a low ratio of gunners to guns. Or perhaps that long gun carriage is really significant because of the approach to battle it reveals.
Fire!
It was not designed to be moved quickly. It was to be used like a gun on a Mediterranean galley, only once during a battle, just before ramming and boarding the enemy. It was not a weapon intended for repeated artillery fighting. The wrecks also show that some Spanish guns were very shoddy. This one, for instance, found on an Armada wreck in Scotland in 1969, has the bore off-center. It was more dangerous to the men who fired it than to the enemy. The coast of the British Isles is littered with this kind of evidence of what went wrong for the Spanish Armada. There was a vast assortment of artillery of every kind, and as you would expect if they intended to fight at close quarters, they carried very efficient anti-personnel weapons.
The Armada had a great variety of guns, most of them quite small, and shot of the smaller calibers it did run out of, because these were quite easily and quickly fired. This one comes from a breech-loading swivel gun, which only requires the chamber to be removed, a new shot to be inserted, and a preloaded chamber put in and wedged in place. Then it can be fired and the same action repeated.
But the evidence also reveals the sort of problems familiar to anyone who has been in a fighting force organized by office wallers.
The great variety of guns throughout the Armada gave rise to another problem: how to find shot of the right size to fit each of them. On the Trinidad Valancera, we found this scale. It's a gunner's rule, and it measures not length, but weight of the bore of the shot required to fit the gun. This one should carry a 40-pound shot, so I call for a 40-pound ball and attempt to put it into the barrel. It doesn't go. The reason is that this scale is calibrated in Italian pounds, and this shot is weighed in Spanish pounds, which were much heavier. Not only that, but within itself, the scale is very inaccurate.
The gunner had to check the shot with a set of rings because he could not trust his scale. But in spite of all these problems with their gunnery, the Armada remained essentially intact. It was an astonishing tribute to their seamanship and the quality of command. Neither side really had many big guns. The English had most, but the English gunners had only actually sunk one ship, and that ship was surrounded by the English and slowly pounded to death.
At the end of the day, both sides had failed to achieve their objectives. The Armada had failed to collect Parma's army, but the English fleet had failed to destroy the Armada.
Nevertheless, many Spanish ships had sustained serious damage, and now the Armada was being driven by a strong wind and could not turn back, and its confidence had been broken. Medina Sidonia reported,
"The Armada was so completely crippled and scattered that my first duty seemed to save it.
We were short of ammunition, and experience had shown how little we could depend upon the ships that remained, the Queen's ships being so superior to ours in this sort of fighting.
In fact, we now know that some of his advisors urged him to surrender. The waiting army in Flanders was abandoned. So far as Medina Sidonia knew, Parma's army was mythical in any case. He had received reports from his own messengers that Parma did not have the men ready and was not in the embarkation area himself. Those reports have been believed ever since. But new, unpublished research in the archives in Simancas Castle in Spain and in the Netherlands has shown that these men were fooled by the devices Parma was using to get out with the maximum surprise.
We have made hard research of 5 years long, and we know now that the troops were prepared and were ready in the ports of embarkation. And we know that the barges that we were going to carry the people and also the horses were also ready. And we know that the weapons were, the cannons and the supplies were also ready.
I think he was quite ready. He had 16,000 soldiers embarked in his ships, in his flat-bottom ships, little ships, overcrowded with maybe 40, 50, 60 soldiers in each flat-bottom ship, like the Dutch modern chalk. So I think he was quite ready at the moment when he should be.
In my opinion, with only the afternoon of the 9th of August, Parma would have been ready for everything, for the embarkation was over.
If that is true, then with only another 6 hours, Parma might have made it. And his invasion army was still there. Perhaps it would try to slip over now without the Armada. That was the fear in England. And with no money to spend on bullets or gunpowder, Elizabeth offered her commander Leicester the cheapest and most powerful weapon in her armory, her own charismatic force. Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, would defend England by the force of her own personality.
Leicester's headquarters were behind me on Gun Hill, from where he could see the fortifications at Tilbury and his army of 4,000 men encamped here in the marshes. He had not been allowed to start collecting an army until April, but it soon became clear he was the most experienced of Elizabeth's commanders in the field. She had greatly alarmed the council by announcing she would ride to the confines of her realm at the head of her own army. Leicester had had 30 years' experience of handling Elizabeth. He suggested it was her duty to remain in London. But knowing her presence would inspire the men, he allowed her to visit his camp here at Tilbury.
She set out for Tilbury 10 days after the Battle of Gravelines. By the time she arrived, the Armada had been blown as far north as Scotland. But somehow she made it seem as though the crisis was about to come the next day, instead of being past already.
I am come, she said, in the midst and heat of the battle, to live or die amongst you all. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king. Aye, and of a king of England, too, and think foul scorn that Spain or Parma, or any foreign prince, should dare to invade the borders of my realm.
They didn't. She sent the army home next day to save pay. The Armada carried on northwards, and Parma took his army away to carry on his war. The English ships were out of ammunition, and Elizabeth refused to pay for any more, but the Armada did not know that. Elizabeth was hunting in Epping Forest when she finally heard that the danger was past. And it is said that she rode straight to her hunting lodge and up the stairs on horseback. To look out in triumph and delight across the trees of England. Her England. And the Duke of Medina Sidonia was now concentrating on bringing his demoralized armada back to Spain without risking another encounter in the Channel, which meant a long journey right around the British Isles. A Danish ship crossing the North Sea in August 1588 reported sailing through thousands of bloated corpses of mules and horses. The Armada was jettisoning what it could. Daily rations were cut. There were many wounded, and dysentery had broken out in every ship. And as the Armada sailed north, the weather grew bitterly cold.
Everybody's heard of the terrible gales that struck the Armada on its way home, but what was the weather really like in the autumn of 1588? Well, we can have a pretty good guess, really, because not only have we got the ship's logs, but we were lucky enough to have regular observations from a Danish astronomer, Tycho Brahe, who at that time was living off the Danish coast. So with his observations, coupled with the ship's logs, we were able to reconstruct the weather maps of that period. The Armada found great difficulty by the time they got around the northwestern side of Scotland, because the winds were predominantly from the south, and it was this wind that pushed them off course. Some of them, in fact, went as far north as within 50 miles of Iceland. So that we found by the beginning of September, or even later than that, they were still, or many of them were still, off the western coast of Scotland, trying desperately to run their way southwards. By the 18th of September, the Duke of Medina Sidonia had already got down into the Bay of Biscay, but ran up against this low pressure area, which gave him some very, very stormy weather indeed. Now, this low continued to work its way northwards and reached this position by the 21st of September. Now, at that time, many of the ships of the Armada were off the western coast of Ireland, but as that low moved northwards, engaged some very cold winds, so the winds strengthened up quite considerably, winds getting up to 50, 60 miles an hour, some very gusty winds, and it was this which caused the devastation on the 21st of September, with reports, in fact, of at least 17 of the ships destroyed.
The climate was much colder than now. Many of the ships were Mediterranean cargo vessels. They were never designed to stand up to the Atlantic.
Now the enemy was the Atlantic weather, and many of the Spanish ships were driven towards the Irish coast. One of them was the Rata en Corunna of Don Alonso de Leiva, Knight of Santiago, with whom had sailed the cream of Spain's nobility. They were wrecked in Blacksod Bay, County Mayo. They got ashore and marched overland to find another Spanish ship, the Duquesa Santa Ana, which had put in for provisions. Together, the two ships' companies sailed aboard the Duquesa, heading again for Spain. But again, they were wrecked and came ashore, though this time Don Alonso was badly injured. They reached Killybegs, and there they found the galleass Girona, damaged and under repair. For 2 weeks, they worked on her until they got her into a condition in which they thought they could risk the short voyage to Scotland. Off the Antrim coast, near the Giant's Causeway, the jury rudder broke and the galleass was driven ashore and smashed to pieces. Practically all of the 1,000 or so people on board perished, nobleman and galley slave alike.
The relics that have been found at the wreck site belonged to the flower of Spain's nobility. This is the Knight's Cross of Santiago. It must have belonged to de Leiva himself. A pendant in the form of a salamander, solid gold and rubies. 1,100 men perished here in a matter of minutes. Altogether, about 60 ships vanished on this terrible journey, and any sailors that did get ashore alive in Ireland were unlikely to survive for long.
The great Venetian grain ship La Trinidad Balancera, converted as an invasion transport, was sinking and made for the Irish coast. She grounded in Kinnigo Bay, and there her crew started to ferry themselves ashore, aided by local Irishmen. The locals were quite helpful towards the Spaniards, although they relieved them of many of their valuable possessions. The ship's commander, Don Alonso de Luzon, commander of the Regiment of Naples, gathered his soldiers together and attempted to march across Ireland, seeking Spanish ships on the west coast to take them home. But they were intercepted by the Queen's soldiers, and on being promised quarter, they surrendered. That quarter was denied. Most of the common soldiers and seamen were gunned down. The officers and noblemen saved for ransom.
The English decided it was safer to kill survivors than to take prisoners. After the tempest, the slaughter.
Por el mes de agosto se presenta en las casas que tiene en Sevilla Medina Sidonia el conde de Orgaz, que es el asistente. El asistente viene a ser pues el gobernador. Y le ordena al administrador que tiene allí el duque que celebre la victoria de Inglaterra, la victoria que ha tenido su señor. Tienen que poner 12 hachas en los corredores, en el corredor blanco y las ventanas, y le ordenan contratar a unos músicos, 2 sacabuches y 4 ministriles, que tocaron para que la gente creyese, la casa estaba vacía, no había nadie, que había fiesta, y cobraron 24 reales, por cierto, por tocar esa noche. Todo Sevilla lo celebra, hay 40 horas de exposición del Santísimo en acción de gracias.
There were weeks of rumor in Spain and Portugal. Drake had been captured. There had been a spectacular landing. And the other voices. The Armada was a ship of fools. Nothing had survived.
Claro, al duque no se le esperaba, no se esperaba que pudiese dar la vuelta a Inglaterra. Y es entonces cuando se dice que la gran tormenta había hundido totalmente a la Armada, después de la victoria. Claro, por mala suerte para Felipe II no fue verdad. Y la Armada se presentan los restos, 65 barcos concretamente. Se presentan, uno de los primeros, el del duque, en Santander.
The shelves of Simancas Castle are laden with petitions from the families of the sailors. As the battered survivors arrived home, the scale of the tragedy became clear. Men were dying as they were carried ashore. Philip insisted on generosity to the survivors, but the bereaved families still had to meet the demands of bureaucracy. When did he die exactly? At what date did his pay stop? Since families in Spain could not know whether their menfolk were dead or simply missing, there were many months of anxiety and many years of penury. For the Protestants, it was the ultimate propaganda triumph. God blew and they were scattered, it says on this Dutch medal. Since God and the Protestant cause were united, the story of the Armada somehow became transformed into the story of a great Protestant victory. Elizabeth's cause must be just. God was so clearly on her side.
At the moment of national triumph, there was a personal tragedy for Elizabeth. Leicester died. He was travelling to Buxton to take the waters, having been ill for a year of a continual fever. He stopped here at Rykert, where he and Elizabeth had so often in the past been guests of the Norris family. This pew was built specially for the Queen. He wrote to ask after her health, being the chiefest thing in the world I do pray for. When she heard of his death, she locked herself in her chamber for several days. Burghley had to order the door broken down. After her own death, they found the note he had written from Rykert in her bedside cabinet. On it, she had written his last letter. She pulled herself together for the great victory service at St. Paul's in November, where she thanked God for that the weakest sex hath been so fortified by the strongest help, that neither my people need find lack at my weakness, nor foreigners triumph at my ruin.
While the celebrations went on, the English fleet remained mobilized. Partly this was to maintain defensive readiness, but there was another reason too. The sailors weren't released until they were paid, and there was no money in the treasury to pay them. So, although they were out of ammunition and short of food and water, the men remained on the ships. On board the Elizabeth Bonaventure, which had sailed out of Plymouth against the Armada with 500 men, only 300 were left alive a month later. The rest had died of starvation or disease.
Lord Admiral Howard was appalled.
It would grieve any man's heart to see them that have served so valiantly die so miserably, and all the ships so foul and unsavory, with many so weakly manned, that they have not mariners to weigh their anchors. It were too pitiful to have men starve after such a service.
When a messenger was sent to the Queen to inform her of the plight of her loyal seamen, he was sent away. The court was too busy celebrating the victory. And the Queen's chief minister, Lord Burleigh, pointed out that in time more men would die, and so the wages bill would be lower. This famous chest, the Chatham chest, was set up in the 17th century to hold the Navy's hardship fund, a fund set up by Howard, Drake, and Hawkins, and the others, because they were so distressed at the hardships their men were enduring. Even so, by Christmas 1588, almost half the sailors who had sailed against the Armada that summer were dead.
It has always been believed that Philip was essentially unshaken by what happened, but we discovered something new in papers rescued from destruction by the Count of Altamira, papers which have lain unread for 400 years.
A great deal has been written about Philip II's reaction to the Armada, but nobody's seen this document before, the most important of all, written after the last of the Armada ships had limped back to Spain. It's written to his chaplain, and in it we find a mixture of anger, anguish, and despair. The king sees the failure of the Armada not as the last chapter in the volume, but as the beginning of a new chain of catastrophes.
I promise you, unless some remedy is discovered, we will very soon see things that will make us wish we had never been born. If God does not send a miracle, I want to die. That is what I pray for. This is for your eyes only. If God does not come back to his cause, we shall see what we fear so much, sooner than anyone thinks. It can only have been permitted to punish us for our sins.
This is undoubtedly a very moving document. It shows that the king has come close to losing his faith, that he is the instrument of God's purpose, and perhaps even to losing his faith in God. If the Protestants had only known that this, the most powerful Catholic ruler in the world, was so reduced by the failure of the Armada, they might indeed have felt that their view was confirmed. God indeed was English.
Philip's words echo the cry heard from the cross. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? The Duke of Medina Sidonia, who had never believed in the enterprise, went back to his estates without visiting the king. On the way, people taunted him. The Duke of Parma, whose own plan had been rejected, was not at court to rebut the whispered charges that he had not prepared an invasion army, that he had let the Armada down. His military career began to fade away. Sir Francis Drake launched a counterattack on Spain which achieved nothing and fell out of favor in England. He finally died of fever on a disastrous expedition to Central America. Elizabeth ruled on, her power beyond challenge, but her favorite Leicester dead and her heart broken. As a great world power, Spain went on. The archive of the Indies in Seville contains the accounts of Spain's treasure routes in the decades that followed the loss of the Armada. Decades when Spain as a world power grew stronger, not weaker. And Philip went back to his prayers and his tax gathering in the hope of constructing another armada and hiding his despair.
I want to die and go to him. That is what I pray for, so as not to see so much ill fortune.
"20,000 crusaders against England had been washed away, and a street cry in Lisbon carried the news.
Which ships got home?
The ones the English missed.
And where are the rest?
The waves will tell you.
What happened to them?
It is said that they are lost.
Do we know their names?
They know them in London.
Stay tuned for a look at the reality behind the fantasy of America's movie mecca on Naked Hollywood, next here on Channel 2.